"What kind of useless junk is this?" my son spat. Then, he raised his hand and slapped me in front of 40 guests, on the night of his 50th birthday, in a house I had cleaned on my hands and knees since dawn. I walked out the back door with a tattered canvas tote bag and a bruise already darkening on my cheekbone. I was 65 years old, with 2 knees that ached when it rained, and nowhere to go. But before that night ended, I would be sitting inside a black Ford Expedition, facing a stranger who would tell me 4 words that would unravel 40 years of lies. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are traveling. My name is Claire Miller Harrison. I'm 65 years old, with hands calloused from years of hard work, and a story that took me decades to find the courage to tell out loud. For 40 years, I lived inside a lie I didn't even know existed. A lie built by people who were supposed to love me, maintained with such care that it felt like the truth even in the darkest hours of the night, when you're alone with your thoughts trying to figure out why life never fits quite the way it should. It all started that Saturday morning in March, a day that seemed like any other Saturday, but carried, without me knowing, the weight of an end that was 40 years overdue. My son, Ethan, was turning 50. The party was set for 6 in the evening at his house, which was also my house, or at least that's what I thought. A 3-story colonial in Brentwood, Los Angeles, which I had helped buy with my husband Henry's Social Security, God rest his soul, and the life savings I'd scraped together from years of sewing for others, hem by hem, button by button, like someone building something grand out of thin threads no one notices. I woke up at 4:30 a.m., before the alarm, before the birds, before the sound of the first bus on the main road. Not because Ethan had asked. Ethan never asked for anything directly. He'd learned early on that he didn't have to. He would simply look at a sink full of dishes or a dusty floor with that expression I knew better than my own face in the mirror, the look of someone who is disappointed but is doing you the favor of staying silent. As if his silence were a mercy I should be grateful for. I learned to read that look the way people learn to read the clouds before a storm. Like someone learning to survive. I swept the driveway in the dark with that old broom with the cracked handle I'd asked to replace 3 times. I scrubbed the 2 downstairs bathrooms with a brush and bleach, kneeling on the floor because my back won't let me do it any other way. I polished the imported white marble dining table that stained if you even looked at it wrong, the kind that looks beautiful in a showroom but is a nightmare in real life. I made 3 types of appetizers, shredded chicken croquettes, mini crab cakes, and puff pastry tartlets with spinach and feta, because Ethan couldn't stand catering. He always said industrial food had no soul, that real food was made by hand, someone else's hands, you understand, never his. While I was frying the first batch, I heard my daughter-in-law, Patricia, come down for breakfast. She walked through the kitchen without looking at me, opened the fridge, stood there for a few seconds with the door open as if the answer to life's problems would appear between the Greek yogurt and the butter, and then remarked to the empty air that she had a headache because the AC in their room was rattling the night before. Then she shut the fridge and left without taking a thing. I said nothing. I poured the coffee I'd already brewed, wiped my hands on the apron a neighbor had given me for Christmas 6 years ago, and went back to the hot oil in the pan. Ethan came down at 10. He was wearing an expensive cotton robe Patricia had bought for his birthday the year before. He walked with that slowness of someone who never had to rush a single second of his life, someone who always knew the world would wait for him. He scanned the decorated living room, the blue balloons I'd blown up the night before until I was dizzy, the floral arrangements I'd bought on Thursday at the flower market because by Friday they'd be wilted, the chairs arranged in a semicircle just as he'd asked, the glasses lined up on the side table, and he said nothing. Not a word. Not a nod. He picked up the cup of coffee I'd left in the right spot, at the right temperature, 2 sugars, dairy-free, went out to the patio with his phone, and stayed there for an hour and a half without showing his face. Patricia appeared at noon, hair done, wearing a new dress that made that expensive swoosh sound when she walked, full makeup as if she were the birthday girl. She stood at the kitchen entrance with that expression I could never quite categorize, not open anger, not affection, but a cold middle ground that made me more uncomfortable than any outright fight. A calculated indifference that left room for denial if anyone ever asked. "Aren't you going to get ready?" she asked. It was 11:40 a.m. The party was at 6. "I have time," I replied. She made that tiny clicking sound with her tongue, the one that isn't a word but says everything, and walked away. My room was on the 3rd floor, the smallest of the rooms. It used to be Henry's home office when we lived in an apartment, then a storage room before it became mine when I moved in. No window to the street, just a small ventilation slit facing the narrow gap between the house and the wall. A twin bed, the same one that came from the guest room when they remodeled the upstairs. A sliding door wardrobe that jammed every time I tried to open it. My grandkids, Ethan's kids, had bedrooms larger than the entire floor of my childhood home. Ensuite bathrooms, built-in TVs, Those perfectly organized toy shelves that Instagram moms post photos of as if organization were a substitute for love. I never complained. After all, I needed them, didn't I? That's what they told me, whenever they remembered to say anything at all. You're getting older, Mom. You couldn't stay in that apartment alone. And I believed it. Or I converted myself to believe it, which is different, but ends up in the same place. I bought Ethan's gift 2 months before the party. A handcrafted rosewood pen with his initial engraved in sterling silver, a capital E, in a script I chose because it looked serious and elegant. It was in a blue velvet box with a handwritten card in my seamstress handwriting, the kind you learn when you realize customers don't want messy labels. It cost me $120, which isn't a small amount on a fixed income. I wrapped it carefully, tying a gold bow the way I'd learned as a girl watching my mother wrap Christmas presents. I had no idea, standing there in the kitchen at 4 p.m. with grease on my hands and hair damp with sweat, that pen would be the last thing I'd ever give my son. The guests started arriving at 6:30. There were about 40 people. Ethan's friends from the law firm where he was a partner. Patricia's friends from the gym and the meditation class she took on Tuesdays. Some second cousins I barely recognized, kids from families I'd lost touch with over years of marriage and moving and life just passing by. I circulated with the trays. I spent the rest of the evening picking up empty glasses, replenishing the charcuterie board with expensive meats Patricia had ordered from a boutique deli, the kind that comes wrapped in craft paper with a wax seal and costs a fortune but lasts 20 minutes at a party. I wiped the condensation rings off the marble table before Patricia noticed. I served the kids, cleaned up spills, and smiled at anyone who looked my way. No one asked my name. Ethan moved through the room receiving hugs and congratulations as if I were part of the furniture, present but invisible, like those ornamental plants people put in corners for photos but never actually water. The gift opening happened around 10. Ethan sat in the center of the beige leather sofa I'd vacuumed that morning. Patricia on one side, their 2 kids on the other, posed like a lifestyle magazine feature. Guests surrounded them, glasses in hand, that happy buzz of successful people who think everything is wonderful. The room lights had been swapped for warmer LEDs at Patricia's request because she said the other light aged her face. I went to get my gift from my room. I walked down the 3 flights of stairs holding the blue velvet box with the gold bow still tight, the bow I'd redone twice because it looked crooked the first time. Ethan looked at the package before I even got close. There was already that look, the one where he was judging it before even opening it. I held out the box without saying a word. He took it. He ripped the bow off carelessly, like opening a bill, opened the velvet box, took out the pen, spun it once between his fingers, clicked it, and then held it up in the air like a piece of evidence before a jury. The room was still noisy when he spoke, but something in the frequency of his voice made the noise fade away slowly, like the volume being turned down on a radio. What kind of useless junk is this? The silence was so sudden that I heard the ice shift in a glass across the room. I heard someone swallow. I heard my own pulse in my left ear. I started to say something. That I'd saved for 2 months. That I knew he liked writing by hand since he was a kid, that I remembered the sketchbook he had when he was 8 and I chose the pen with that in mind. Ethan didn't let me finish. 3, maybe 4 words left my mouth before the sound of a chair dragging on the hardwood floor cut me off. He stood up. And his hand moved before I could finish my sentence. Open palm. Left side of my face. The sound was sharp, dry, the kind that doesn't need to echo because the absence of noise afterward is enough. My head snapped to the side. My glasses slipped and hit the floor. Someone let out an audible gasp. A young woman, who I later found out was an intern at Ethan's firm, put both hands over her mouth. No one moved. Patricia looked down at her phone. Ethan's 2 children looked at each other with that expression kids get when they don't quite understand what happened but know it's bad. Only one person stood up. My cousin Sophie. 72 years old, snow-white hair, a tiny frame that always made her look smaller than she was until she opened her mouth. She had driven in from San Diego for the party, bringing a homemade orange bundt cake in a cardboard box she'd reinforced with packing tape. Ethan, Sophie said, her voice not asking, but commanding. You just hit your mother in front of everyone. Ethan snapped back that she didn't know anything about their family business. Sophie didn't sit down. She stood there looking at me, and I'll never forget that look. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy, it was recognition. It was the look of someone who saw something and refused to pretend they hadn't. I leaned down to pick up my glasses. My hand shook a little, but I wasn't going to let him see it. I stood up slowly, the way your knees do when the cartilage doesn't cooperate anymore. I stood tall, glasses on my face, and looked at Ethan for 1 second, just 1 second, long enough to burn that image into my mind for when I needed a reason not to come back. Then I went upstairs. In that small 3rd floor room, I grabbed the canvas tote I'd bought at a farmer's market 15 years ago for $8. It was still in one piece because I took care of things. I packed what I could, 2 cotton shirts, a pair of sweatpants, jeans without holes, my toothbrush, the old phone charger Ethan had given me when he upgraded because it's good enough for what you do. The rosary that belonged to my mother, Martha. The notebook of recipes and sewing techniques I'd carried since I was 30, the edges yellowed and the cover marked by the humidity of 2 moves. And from a box of old documents I'd dug through 3 months earlier when Ethan told me to organize the old paperwork before throwing it out, a manila envelope with the header of a vital records office from a small town in West Virginia I'd never visited and whose name I didn't recognize. I didn't understand what it was. But something, I can't call it anything but instinct, that bodily intelligence that has no words but plenty of conviction, made me fold that envelope and put it in my bag. I went down the back stairs, out through the kitchen door, and the March night air hit my face with that mixture of cold and exhaust that only LA has, as if the whole city were breathing at once. No one called my name. I walked down Magnolia Avenue with no destination, just moving forward because stopping felt scarier than continuing. My knees ached, as they always do after 9 p.m., that dull pain that rises slowly like a tide. The bruise on my cheekbone throbbed in sync with my heart. The street was nearly empty. A tabby cat crossed in front of me and looked at me with that quiet sovereignty cats have. A second-story window showed the blue glow of someone watching TV, and I stared for a second, thinking about how much of a normal life that person was taking for granted, without even knowing it. I walked for maybe 2 miles, maybe 3. I wasn't measuring. I was just going, which is different from knowing where you're headed. That's when the headlights appeared behind me. Too slow to be casual, too fast to be a coincidence. A black Ford Expedition, one of those large SUVs that seems to move without making a sound, with tinted windows that hid everything inside. It pulled up about 10 feet away. The hazard lights blinked twice and stayed on, orange against the wet asphalt. The back door opened with that vacuum seal sound of an expensive car. A woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, maybe a bit older. Short, gray hair, cut with no vanity but no neglect, the haircut of someone who had more important things to think about. A light gray blazer, dark trousers, low heels. She carried a brown leather briefcase under her arm, standing with the posture of someone who spent her life making hard decisions and had learned not to shake while making them. She looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to name yet. A mix of urgency and care. I should have run. My instincts told me to run. An old woman alone on the street at night, a dark van, a stranger. But I was 65, with bad knees, a tattered bag, and nowhere to go. And there was something, call it intuition, call it faith, call it being tired of being afraid my whole life, that made me stand still. "Mrs. Harrison?" the woman asked. That stopped me cold. She knew my name. "My name is Beatrice Solomon. I'm an attorney specializing in family law and estates." She paused for a beat, choosing her words carefully. "I need to talk to you about your husband, Henry. And about a document that was signed 38 years ago, in October of 1986, in a courthouse in rural West Virginia." My heart dropped and then hammered against my ribs. Henry had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that's too fast to prepare for and too slow to not suffer every single day. We married in 1981. We were together for 42 years before he left, and I never once thought there was something about my marriage I didn't know. "What do you know about Henry?" I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. Beatrice opened her briefcase. She pulled out a small photograph, worn at the edges like a photo that had been kept and looked at many times. A crease in the right corner, as if someone had carried it in their pocket for a long time. In the photo, a young man with dark hair was smiling sideways at the camera, hugging a woman with curly hair who was laughing with her head thrown back. Between them was a baby with large, dark eyes. I recognized those eyes before I understood why. They were my eyes. "This man is Henry," Beatrice said. "Before he became the Henry you knew. Younger, before he moved to California. The woman next to him is Sarah. She was your biological mother. The world didn't spin like it does in the movies. There was no dramatic music, no sidewalk cracking open under my feet. It was more like that moment when you're reading a book you think you know and suddenly realize you've misinterpreted an entire sentence from the very beginning, and you have to go back and reread everything with new eyes." "That's not possible," I said. "This will be hard to hear," Beatrice said. "But you deserve to know." I got into the car. The interior of the Ford was warm, with that gentle luxury heat that feels like a hug. It was the warmest I'd been all night. Beatrice and I sat in the back, the briefcase open between us, documents organized like evidence for a trial decades in the making. Beatrice told the story the way someone tells something they've studied for a long time but still finds hard to believe. Henry Harrison had an older brother, Thomas. The two grew up in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia. Thomas was the oldest, the one who took on responsibility early, the one who married early too, to a woman named Sarah, an artist with a free spirit who felt suffocated in a small town that had no room for anyone different. Thomas and Sarah had a son, Ethan. Then, when Ethan was 2, Sarah got pregnant again. But the marriage had already crumbled from the inside, it was only standing for appearances, which was what Thomas was good at. Thomas didn't want the second child. Sarah wasn't in a position to raise 2 kids alone without Thomas's financial support. And Henry, who had moved to Los Angeles at 23 and had been married for just a few months to Martha, my adoptive mother, the woman I knew as my mother and will always call Mom, agreed to take the child, me. They registered me as their biological daughter. In a small district where the clerk was a distant cousin of the Harrison family and where, in 1986, certain things were still settled with a handshake and a favor. My birth certificate said, Claire Marie Harrison, daughter of Henry Louis Harrison and Martha Jane Harrison. Period. No asterisk, no footnote, not the slightest hint of the other story happening beneath it. Thomas stayed in West Virginia with Ethan. Sarah moved to New York. And Henry raised me in LA. Believing, or making me believe, that I was his and Martha's biological child. When I was 22, Henry and Martha introduced me to Ethan. They said he was the son of a cousin of Henry's who had lost his family and needed a chance. Ethan was 20, newly arrived in California, looking for work and stability. Henry helped him get an internship at a law firm. I treated him like a brother from day one, because that's what I was taught he was. And that's how it started. Except Ethan knew. Ever since he was 18, when Thomas, his father, my biological father, sat him down and told him everything. He told him I was his half-sister. He told him there was an inheritance at stake. He told him that if Thomas ever died, I would be entitled to half of everything he had built. And Ethan used that information not to get closer to me as family, but to keep me close for control. Not with open blackmail, but with that silent weight of someone who knows a secret and lets you feel it without ever confirming it. A cage without visible bars. The worst kind. How do you know all this? I asked Beatrice. Beatrice pulled more papers from the folder. The original birth certificate, the one replaced by the LA record. A series of letters between Thomas and Henry from 1986, in unmistakable handwriting, where Henry confirmed he'd received the baby and would raise her as his own. And a more recent document, Thomas Harrison's last will and testament, recorded 8 months before he died in November of last year. Thomas was dead. And before he died, he had hired Beatrice to find his daughter. Me. Thomas left everything documented, Beatrice said. Including the fact that Ethan knew. He knew since he was 18. And he had been informed that in the division of the estate, he would have half as the son of the first wife, and you would have the other half as a recognized daughter. I sat in silence. The car was parked now, hazard lights still blinking. What estate? Beatrice put the papers back with the calm of someone who has given bad news many times. Thomas was the majority partner in a regional electrical supply company since 1993. A solid business that grew with the housing booms. When he died, the company was appraised. She paused. Claire, we are talking about a net worth of approximately $2.3 million, to be divided between the legal heirs, $2.3 million. I had slept in a twin bed in a storage room. I had woken up at 4:30 a.m. to fry appetizers. I had spent 4 years cleaning the bathrooms of a house I helped pay for. $2.3 million. But there was more. Beatrice pointed to the manila envelope I'd pulled from my bag. She opened it carefully. This document is a summary of an out-of-court settlement. Her voice hardened. Ethan, using a power of attorney he claims was signed by you, waived the inheritance from Thomas on behalf of both of you. On his own behalf and yours. I looked at her. I never signed any power of attorney. That is exactly what we are going to prove. A fraudulent power of attorney. And 2 years ago, that paper Patricia had asked me to sign to help organize the household finances, which a lawyer had prepared and I had signed without really reading because no one explained it and I trusted them. I trusted them because trust was all I had instead of information. That second paper was a waiver of rights to any future assets I might receive through inheritance. Ethan had made me give away my own inheritance before I even knew I had one to give. I stared at the envelope in my lap. That paper I'd pulled almost by accident from a box meant for the trash. That paper I'd kept without knowing why, just the instinct of a seamstress who never throws away a thread that might still be useful. Sometimes survival works in the dark before we even understand what it's saving. Beatrice took me to a hotel on Wilshire Boulevard. Not flashy luxury, but clean and bright. White sheets that smelled like lavender. A wooden desk. And a window, a real window, that looked out over the lit-up avenue, with its night buses and old trees and people passing by who have no idea they are the backbone of a whole city. I stood in the middle of the room for I don't know how long. It was the first time in 4 years I'd slept in a room that was just mine, with a real window, without hearing the water heater rattling through the wall. I opened the curtains. There was the city, the one that doesn't sleep, and I watched it as if looking out a window were a right I'd forgotten I had. That night, the memories came the way damned up things do, all at once, out of order, in layers. I had arrived at Ethan's house with $70 in my wallet, Henry's Social Security partially eaten up by medical bills and funeral costs, and the certainty that I was doing the right thing. After all, he was my son. After all, he needed me. After all, my mother Martha always said family is what you have when you have nothing else. And I took that lesson so seriously I didn't notice when they stopped treating what was between us as family and started treating it as a bill I was paying without knowing it. In 3 months, Ethan had suggested, with that calm voice of someone doing a favor, that I take over the grocery bills with my Social Security check while their car loan was being paid off. The loan was paid off 18 months later. The grocery bills remained mine. In 6 months, I was waking up at 5 a.m. to have coffee ready before Patricia woke up because she'd mentioned once she couldn't start her day without hot coffee waiting, and I'd taken that as a need for me to fulfill. In a year, I was the cook, the maid, and the nanny without anyone ever saying it out loud, without a conversation, an agreement, or a thank you. It just happened. When I tried to say something, rarely, because I learned early that complaining had a price, Ethan used that serene, tired voice of someone explaining something for the 10th time to a slow child. You have nowhere else to go, Mom. We're here for you. As if being there were a gift, not a gear in a machine. As if the gratitude he demanded were fair and not manufactured. And I believed it. How many times I believed it. How many early mornings I scrubbed that bathroom on my knees thinking I was being useful, showing love the only way I had left. But I wasn't a burden. I was capital. The Social Security check. The blocked inheritance. The unpaid domestic labor. Control over a woman who didn't know there was anything to be controlled. At 3 a.m., I did what I always do when the world stops making sense. I took the sewing notebook from my bag and made a list. Not of tasks, of evidence. Everything I remembered signing in the 4 years I lived with Ethan. Everything they'd asked me to agree to. Everything I'd handed over without asking because trust was all I had. The list had 11 items when I finally closed the notebook. The hearing at the notary's office was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after that night on Magnolia Avenue. It wasn't a movie courtroom with a stage and a jury. It was a conference room with a long glass table, black leather chairs, a pitcher of water no one touched, and an AC unit that made a constant hum. But there was a weight in that room that I felt the moment I walked in, the weight of truths about to be laid on the table officially, with stamps and signatures, with no more room for denial. The notary presiding was a woman in her 50s. Hair tied back, wire-rimmed glasses, the posture of someone who deals with documents all day and has learned that every piece of paper represents a real life. Ethan arrived with his lawyer, a young woman with the expression of someone who received a difficult case too late to prepare. Patricia stayed outside in the hallway. Ethan walked in with his shoulders back and that chin-up attitude I'd known for 40 years, the posture of someone who still believes they'll walk out exactly as they walked in. He looked at me when I entered. It was the first time we'd seen each other since the party. Since the slap. Since the pen on the floor. I didn't look down. That was new for both of us. Beatrice presented the evidence in the order she'd practiced, like someone telling a story that already has an ending. The DNA first. The lab report, the documented chain of custody, the number, 99.4%. The notary examined the report, adjusted her glasses, and set it on the table with a nod. The correspondence from 1986 next. Henry confirming the informal adoption in writing, asking his brother never to tell Claire, so as not to confuse the girl. Henry's handwriting, which I recognized before even reading the words, the script from birthday cards and grocery lists. Thomas's will. The formal recognition of his daughter. The mandated division of the estate. And finally, the power of attorney. The handwriting expert's report. The signature that wasn't mine. Ethan's lawyer made an objection about the validity of a delayed recognition. Beatrice responded with legal precedents cited from memory, without even glancing at her notes. The notary took notes. Ethan spoke once. In that calm voice I'd heard for 40 years, the one that sounded like reason but had always been control. He said he had managed affairs in his mother's name because she didn't understand business. He said he had acted in her best interest. The notary took off her glasses and looked at him for a moment. Did you manage things in her interest, or in her place, without her consent? Ethan didn't answer. When they gave me the floor, I knew what I wanted to say. I hadn't rehearsed it. I hadn't asked Beatrice to check it. Some things need to come out exactly as they are inside, without polish. I said I spent 40 years believing Ethan was my son. That I worked for him as if I were working for an extension of Henry, of the love Henry had taught me. That I woke up at 4:30 a.m. on his 50th birthday so everything would be perfect, not because I was forced, but because I still believed, after everything, that was family. I said the pen I brought him cost $120 and 2 months of savings from a check I used entirely to support the house I helped buy. And I got a slap in front of 40 people in return. I told them I wasn't there out of anger. Anger passes. I was there because a man I never got to call Dad had left a record of the truth before he died, because he wanted me to know who I was while there was still life left to live with that knowledge. I'm not asking this table to punish Ethan, I said. I'm asking you to tell the truth. Because I deserve at least that. Because anyone deserves at least that. The room went quiet. That silence that isn't empty, it's full of things people are processing. The notary took 18 minutes to draft the terms. I watched the wall clock for every single one of them. When she finished, she read it aloud, and every paragraph was a door that had been locked for decades slowly creaking open. The power of attorney was declared invalid due to lack of consent and forged signature. The waiver signed 2 years prior was annulled due to fraudulent omission. I had never been informed of the existence of the inheritance I was waiving, making the consent legally void. My recognition as the legal daughter of Thomas Harrison was recorded. My share of the estate was established at 50% of the net assets. And the case was referred to the district attorney's office for investigation of fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. The sound of the stamp hitting the document was the loudest sound I'd heard in years. Louder than the slap. Louder than 40 years of accumulated silence. It sounded like a lock turning from the inside. The hallway of the office smelled like paper and old building AC. My steps echoed on the granite floor as I walked toward the exit with Beatrice by my side. I heard the quick footsteps behind me before I heard the voice. Irregular steps, like someone not used to walking fast in heels. Aunt Claire. It was Lily. Ethan's oldest daughter, my granddaughter, 18 years old. She'd been outside during the whole hearing. Her makeup was smudged, that mascara that runs when you really cry. She looked smaller than usual. She took up less space, like she'd shriveled while listening to what was being said on the other side of the door. I didn't know, she said, her voice breaking. About the money, about the inheritance, about what my dad did. I thought you lived with us because you wanted to. Because we were family. I stopped. I looked at her for a moment, this girl I'd seen born, who I'd taught to bake, who I'd stayed up with when she had a fever at 7 while Ethan and Patricia were on a trip. Part of me wanted to say it was too late, that the damage was done. Part of me was just too tired for anything but leaving. But what I felt standing there, with my name registered as mine again and the March sun coming through the hallway window, wasn't anger at Lily. It was clarity. She hadn't chosen her father. And I knew well what it was like to grow up in a house where you believe things are one way because you've never been shown the other. Lily, I said. It wasn't your fault. But what you do with what you know now, that's your choice. She nodded with that expression of someone hearing something that will take time to settle. I knew her well enough to know she was a good girl in a family that had learned not to look uncomfortable things in the face. I hope she learns to look. Ethan was at the end of the hall, leaning against the wall by a corner plant, jacket open, tie loose, with that look of someone who thought they knew the terrain and found out they knew nothing. His lawyer was a few steps away, on the phone, already reorganizing for what was coming next. I walked past him without stopping. But then I heard it. The voice I'd heard for 40 years, with that tone of authority that had lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have. Claire. I stopped. I turned. Ethan looked at me with an expression I'd never seen, or never recognized. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to disbelief, like he couldn't believe the narrative he'd built had actually collapsed. After everything I did for you, he said. 40 years. A home, a family. And this is how it ends. I stared at him for a moment. This 50-year-old man I had invested everything in, believing it was love. And then I understood. Even here, with the notary's stamp still fresh, Ethan believed he had done something for me. He believed I owed him gratitude. He thought keeping a woman in ignorance of her own rights, using her labor and her money and her 40 years of trust, was a form of care. It wasn't anger I felt. It was recognition. The kind that only comes when you finally see what was always happening, and you realize the pain wasn't your fault. My name is Claire Harrison, I said. And you never did anything for me. You did everything to me. For 40 years. And now, it's over. I turned and walked out. Beatrice held the door. The last thing I saw before getting into the black SUV was Ethan standing in that hallway, looking at the space where I used to be, like someone who doesn't yet understand that what's gone isn't coming back. I got in. The door shut with that vacuum seal. And I breathed. Today, I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Silver Lake. 2nd floor, no elevator, which my niece complain about sometimes, but it's the kind of complaint I accept because the apartment has large windows that look out onto a street with old trees that cast generous shadows on the sidewalk. The first thing I did when the realtor showed me the place was open every single window. He watched me with a confused look, but he waited. I needed to feel the air coming in for real, without a ventilation slit or the smell of a water heater. The inheritance was partially released while the process is still ongoing. I didn't do anything extravagant. I paid 6 months of rent in advance. I bought a good bed, the kind with the right springs. I bought a new mattress because the old one had been a guest room hand-me-down and I didn't want anything that had belonged to someone else first. I hired a physical therapist for my knees, 2 sessions a week, and I can already walk down the stairs without gripping the handrail. I signed up for a sewing class at a community center nearby. Not because I need to learn, I've sewn my whole life, but because I want to sew because I choose to. Because choice is what I've learned to have. Beatrice and I have coffee once a month at a bakery near her office. She doesn't charge for the friendship. She charges for the work, which is how it should be. Clear relationships give me much more security now than confusing ones ever did. Sophie, my cousin who stood up that night when no one else would, came to visit 2 weeks after I moved. She brought an orange bundt cake in the same reinforced box. We sat on the balcony all afternoon, drinking coffee and talking about nothing important, and it was the most restful afternoon I've had in years. Sometimes the right company doesn't need a topic, just presence. As for Ethan, he's facing charges. His lawyer quit 2 weeks after the hearing. Patricia filed for divorce a month later. She found financial discrepancies in the marriage that I won't detail here, but they confirm that some people treat everyone around them the same way, not just their old mother-in-law. Lily texted me last month. She said she got a job and was trying to understand the difference between what she grew up thinking was true and what actually was. I told her that would take time, but the fact that she's trying is more than most people do. It's a start. I go to therapy every Thursday. A doctor named Dr. Sarah, who has an office with soft plum-colored walls and a leafy plant she calls the plant that never dies because I never forget to water it. She doesn't tell me what to feel. She asks questions and lets me find my own answers, which, after a life of being told what to think and how to be grateful, feels like learning a language I always had inside but was never allowed to speak. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It would be simpler if it did, if there were a date on the calendar where the pain ended and well-being began. But it's not like that. There are mornings I wake up at 5 o'clock with that old sense of urgency, heart racing with a to-do list that doesn't exist anymore, a vague guilt for not having done anything yet. The conditioning of 40 years doesn't unravel in 6 months. It probably doesn't unravel in 6 years. But then I open the curtains. And there are the trees, and the sun coming in at 7 a.m., and the sound of a neighborhood waking up. And I remember where I am. I think of Henry sometimes. Not with anger, the anger passed faster than I expected. I think of him with something closer to sadness and understanding. He raised me with genuine love, I believe that. And he carried a secret that got too heavy over the years, and he never found the way to put it down. Maybe he tried to tell me in those final days, but the illness took the words before they could reach me. I'll never know. But I prefer to believe he wanted me to know. I think of Thomas. A man who died before I could look him in the eye and say it was okay. But he knew it before he left. He hired Beatrice, he left the DNA material, he wrote the will with care. He gave me what there was to give. And I don't intend to waste it. I want to make one thing clear before I finish. This story isn't about revenge. I know it sounds like it is, the legal case, the recovered inheritance. But revenge would be wanting Ethan to suffer what I suffered, and I don't want that. I want him to be held accountable. Those are very different things. Revenge is a fire you light hoping it burns someone else. Accountability is just turning on the light so everyone can see what was already there. If you are in a family where you are tolerated instead of loved. If someone uses what you built as if it were their property. If you wake up before the sun to serve people who will never say thank you. If they taught you that gratitude means silence and that questioning is ingratitude. I want you to hear this, you are not the problem. You never were. The people who made you feel like a burden were carrying their own debts and transferred them to you because you were strong enough to carry them for a long time. You aren't weak because you endured. You are human. You deserve to know your own name. You deserve a window that looks out at the world. You deserve a bed that is yours before it belongs to anyone else. You deserve to wake up without a to-do list that isn't yours. Family isn't the paper signed at a courthouse. It's not the roof they put over your head after taking the floor from under your feet. It's not the gratitude they demand as payment for things you never asked to owe. Family is the person who holds the door. The one who stands up when no one else will. The one who says thank you for the $120 pen and understands exactly what it cost. Last week, my therapist asked me how I describe my life now in one sentence. I didn't need much time to think. Now I know where I came from. And for the first time, I choose where I'm going. My name is Claire Harrison. I'm 65 years old. I have 2 knees that still ache when it rains, a canvas tote bag that's still with me because I took care of it, and a story that took too long to tell but is finally mine. I am not the burden they taught me to believe I was. I never was. Now, if you like this story, click subscribe, and let me know in the comments, which part of this story left you speechless. Also, don't forget to become a member for access to exclusive videos. I'll see you there.